I'm thrilled to be telling you the story behind the story of Who Moved My Cheese because it means the book has now been written and is available for all of us to read, enjoy, and share with us. This is something I've wanted to see happen ever since I first heard Spencer Johnson tell his great cheese story years ago, before we wrote our book 1 Minute Manager together. I remember thinking then how good the story was and how helpful it would be to me from that moment on. As time went on, Sniff and Scurry continued their routine. They arrived early each morning and sniffed and scratched and scurried around Cheese Station C, inspecting the area to see if there had been any changes from the day before. Then they would sit down to nibble on the cheese. One morning, they arrived at Cheese Station C and discovered there was no cheese. They weren't surprised, since Sniff and Scurry had noticed the supply of cheese had been getting smaller every day. They were prepared for the inevitable and knew instinctively what to do. They looked at each other, removed their running shoes they had tied together and hung conveniently around their necks, put them on their feet, and laced them up. The mice did not overanalyze things. To the mice, the problem and the answer were both simple. The situation at Cheese Station C had changed. So, Sniff and Scurry decided to change. They both looked out into the maze. Then Sniff lifted his nose, sniffed, and nodded to Scurry, who took off running through the maze, while Sniff followed as fast as he could. They were quickly off in search of new cheese. Later that same day, him and How arrived at Cheese Station C. They had not been paying attention to the small changes that had been taking place each day, so they took it for granted their cheese would be there. They were unprepared for what they found. What? No cheese? Him yelled. He continued yelling, no cheese! No cheese! As though if he shouted loud enough, someone would put it back. Who moved my cheese? He hollered. Finally, he put his hands on his hips. His face turned red, and he screamed at the top of his voice, it's not fair. How just shook his head in disbelief. He too had counted on finding cheese at Cheese Station C. He stood there for a long time, frozen with shock. He was just not ready for this. Him was yelling something, but How didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to deal with what was facing him. So he just tuned everything out. The little people's behavior was not very attractive or productive, but it was understandable. Finding cheese wasn't easy, and it meant a great deal more to the little people than just having enough of it to eat every day. Finding cheese was the little people's way of getting what they thought they needed to be happy. They had their own ideas of what cheese meant to them, depending on their tastes. For some, finding cheese was having material things. For others, it was enjoying good health or developing a spiritual sense of well-being. For How, cheese just meant feeling safe, having a loving family someday, and living in a cozy cottage on Cheddar Lane. To him, cheese was becoming a big cheese in charge of others and owning a big house atop Camembert Hill. Because cheese was important to them, the two little people spent a long time trying to decide what to do. All they could think of was to keep looking around Cheeseless Station C to see if the cheese was really gone. While Sniff and Scurry had quickly moved on, him and How continued to him and How. They ranted and raved at the injustice of it all. How started to get depressed. What would happen if the cheese wasn't there tomorrow? He had made future plans based on this cheese. The little people couldn't believe it. How could this have happened? No one had warned them. It wasn't right. It was not the way things were supposed to be. Him and Hal went home that night hungry and discouraged, but before they left, Hal wrote on the wall, "The more important your cheese is to you, the more you want to hold on to it." The next day, him and Hal left their homes and returned to Cheese Station C again, where they still expect somehow to find their cheese. The situation hadn't changed. The cheese was no longer there. The little people didn't know what to do. Him and Hal just stood there, immobilized, like two statues. Hal shut his eyes as tight as he could and put his hands over his ears. He just wanted to block everything out. He didn't want to know the cheese supply had gradually been getting smaller. He believed it had been moved all of a sudden. Him analyzed the situation over and over, and eventually his complicated brain, with its huge belief system, took hold. "Why did they do this to me?" he demanded. "What's really going on here?" Finally, Hal opened his eyes, looked around, and said, "By the way, where are Sniff and Scary? Do you think they know something we don't?" Him scoffed. "What would they know?" Him continued. "They're just mice. They just respond to what happens. We are little people. We are smarter than mice. We should be able to figure this out." "I know we are smarter," Hal said, "but we don't seem to be acting smarter at the moment. Things are changing around here." Him, "Maybe we need to change and do things differently." "Why should we change?" Him asked. "We are little people. We are special. This sort of thing shouldn't happen to us. Or if it does, we should at least get some benefits." "Why should we get benefits?" Hal asked. "Because we are entitled," Him claimed. "Entitled to what?" Hal wanted to know. "We are entitled to our cheese." "Why?" Hal asked. "Because we didn't cause this problem," Him said. "Somebody else did this, and we should get something out of it." Hal suggested, "Maybe we should simply stop analyzing the situation so much and go find some new cheese." "Oh no," Him argued. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this." While him and Hal were still trying to decide what to do, Sniff and Scurry were already well on their way. They went farther into the maze, up and down corridors, looking for cheese in every cheese station they could find. They didn't think of anything else but finding new cheese. They didn't find any for some time until they finally went into an area of the maze where they had never been before. Cheese Station N. They squealed with delight. They found what they had been looking for, a great supply of new cheese. They could hardly believe their eyes. It was the biggest store of cheese the mice had ever seen. In the meantime, Hal smiled. He knew Him was wondering who moved my cheese, but Hal was wondering, why didn't I get up and move with the cheese sooner? As he started out into the maze, Hal looked back to where he had come from and felt its comfort. He could feel himself being drawn back into familiar territory, even though he hadn't found cheese here for some time. Hal became more anxious and wondered if he really wanted to go out into the maze. He wrote a saying on the wall ahead of him and started at it for some time. What would you do if you weren't afraid? He thought about it. He knew sometimes some fear can be good. When you are afraid, things are going to get worse. If you don't do something, it can prompt you into action. But it's not good when you are so afraid that it keeps you from doing anything. He looked to his right, to the part of the maze where he had never been, and felt the fear. Then he took a deep breath, turned right into the maze, and jogged slowly into the unknown. As he tried to find his way, how worried at first that he might have waited too long in Cheese Station C. He hadn't had any cheese for so long that he was now weak. It took him longer and it was more painful than usually to get through the maze. He decided that if he ever got the chance again, he would get out of his comfort zone and adapt to change sooner. It would make things easier. Then Howe smiled a weak smile as he thought, better late than never. During the next several days, Howe found a little cheese here and there, but nothing that lasts very long. He had hoped to find enough cheese to take some back to him and encourage him to come out into the maze. But Howe didn't feel confident enough yet. He had to admit he found it confusing in the maze. Things seemed to have changed since the last time he was out here. Just when he thought he was getting ahead, he would get lost in the corridors. It seemed his progress was 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. It was a challenge, but he had to admit that being back in the maze hunting for cheese wasn't nearly as bad as he feared it might be. As time went on, he began to wonder if it was realistic for him to expect to find new cheese. He wondered if he had bitten off more than he could chew. Then he laughed, realizing that he had nothing to chew on at that moment. Whenever he started to get discouraged, he reminded himself that what he was doing, as uncomfortable as it was at the moment, was in reality much better than staying in the cheeseless situation. He was taking control rather than simply letting things happen to him. Then he reminded himself if Sniff and Scurry could move on, so could he. Later, as Howe looked back on things, he realized that the cheese at Cheese Station C had not just disappeared overnight, as he had once believed. The amount of cheese that had been there toward the end had been getting smaller, and what was left had grown old. It didn't taste as good. Mold may even have begun to grow, and the old cheese, although he hadn't noticed it. He had to admit, however, that if he had wanted to, he probably could have seen what was coming, but he didn't. Howe now realized that the change probably would not have taken him by surprise if he had been watching what was happening all along and if he had anticipated change. Maybe that's what Sniff and Scurry had been doing. He decided he would stay more alert from now on. He would expect change to happen and look for it. He would trust his basic instincts to sense when change was going to occur and be ready to adapt to it. He stopped for a rest and wrote on the wall of the maze. Smell the cheese often so you know when it's getting old. Sometimes later, after not finding cheese for what seemed like a long time, Hal finally came across a huge cheese station, which looked promising when he went inside. However, he was most disappointed to discover that the cheese station was empty. This empty feeling him no. This empty feeling has happened to me too. This empty feeling has happened to me too. Often he thought he felt like giving up. Hal was losing his physical strength. He knew he was lost. Hal was losing his physical strength. He knew he was lost and was afraid he would not survive. He thought about turning around and heading back to Cheese Station C. At least, if he made it back and him was still there, I wouldn't be alone. Then he asked himself to then he asked himself the same question again. What would I do if I weren't afraid? How thought he was past his fear, but he was How thought he was past his fear, but he was afraid more often than he liked to admit, even to himself. He wasn't always sure what he was afraid of, but in his weakened condition, he knew now he was simply fearful of going on alone. How didn't know it, but he was running behind because he was still wait. How didn't how didn't know it, but he was running behind because he was still weighed down by fearful beliefs. How wondered if him had moved on, or if he was still paralyzed by his own fears. Then How remembered the times when he had felt his best in the maze. It was when he was moving along. It was when he was moving along. He wrote on the wall, knowing it was as much a he wrote on the wall, knowing it was as much a reminder to himself as it was a marking for his friend him, hopefully to follow. Movement in a new direction helps you find new cheese. How looked down the How looked down the dark passageway. How looked down the How looked down the dark passageway and was aware of his fear. What lay ahead? Was it empty? Or worse, were there dangers lurking? He began to imagine all kinds of frightening. He began to imagine all kinds of frightening. He began to imagine He began to imagine all kinds of frightening things that could happen to him. He was scaring himself to death. Then he laughed at himself. He realized his fears were making things worse. So he did what he would do if he weren't afraid. He moved in a new direction. As he started running down the dark corridors, he began to smile. How didn't realize it yet. But he was discovering what nourished his soul. He was letting go and trusting what lay ahead for him, even though he did not know exactly what he was. To his surprise, Howe started to enjoy himself more and more. Why do I feel so good? He wondered. I don't have any cheese, and I don't have any cheese, and I don't know where am I going. Before long, he knew why he felt good. He stopped to write again on the wall. When you stop being afraid, you feel good. Howe realized he had been held captive by his own fear. Moving in a new direction had freed him. Now he felt the cool breeze that was blowing in this part of the maze, and it was refreshing. Howe realized he had been held captive by his own fear. Moving in a new direction had freed him. Now he felt the cool breeze that was blowing in this part of the maze, and it was refreshing. He took in some deep breaths and felt invigorated. He took in some deep breath and felt invigorated by the movement. Once he had gotten past his fear, it turned out to be more enjoyable than he once believed it could be. Howe hadn't felt this way for a long time. Howe hadn't felt this way for a long time. He had almost forgotten how much fun it was to go for it. To make things even better, Howe started to paint a picture in his mind again. He saw himself in great realistic detail, sitting in the middle of a pile of all his favorite cheeses, from cheddar to brie. He saw himself eating the many cheeses he liked, and he enjoyed what he saw. Then he imagined how much he would enjoy all their great tastes. The more clearly he saw the image of himself enjoying new cheese, the more real and believable it became. He could sense that he was going to find it. He wrote, "Imagining yourself enjoying your new cheese leads you to it." Then he raced through the maze with greater strength and agility. Then he raced through the maze with greater strength and agility. Before long, he spotted a cheese station and became excited as he noticed little pieces of new cheese near the entrance. There were types of cheese he had never seen before. There were types of cheese he had never seen before, but they looked great. He tried them and found that they were delicious. He ate He ate most of the new cheese bits that were available and put a few in his pocket to have later and perhaps share with him. He began to regain his strength. He entered, to, he entered the cheese station with great excitement, but to his dismay, he found it was empty. Someone had already been there. Someone had already been there and had left only the few bits of new cheese. He realized that if he had moved sooner, he would very likely have found a good deal of new cheese here. Howe decided to go back and see if him was ready to join him. As he retraced his steps, he stopped and wrote on the wall. After a while, Howe made his way back to Cheese Station C and found him. He offered him bits of new cheese, but was turned down. Him appreciated his friend's gesture, but said, "I don't think I would like new cheese. It's not what I'm used to. I want my own cheese back, and I'm not going to change until I get what I want." Howe just shook his head in disappointment and reluctantly went back out on his own. As he returned to the farthest point he had reached in the maze, he missed his friend, but realized he liked what he was discovering even before he found what he hoped would be a great supply of new cheese. If ever he knew that what made him happy wasn't just having cheese, he was happy when he wasn't being run by his fear. He liked what he was doing now. Knowing this, Howe didn't feel as weak as he didn't. Howe didn't feel as weak as he did when he stayed in Cheese Station C with no cheese, just realizing he was not letting his fear stop him, and knowing that he had taken a new direction nourished him and gave him strength. Now he felt that it was just a question of time before he found what he needed. In fact, he sensed he had already found what he was looking for. He smiled as he realized. The quicker you let go of old cheese, the sooner you find new cheese. Howe realized again, as he had once before. Howe realized again, as he had once before, that what you are afraid of is never as bad as what you imagine. The fear you let build up in your mind is worse than the situation that actually exists. He had been so afraid of never finding new cheese that he had never so afraid of never finding new cheese that he didn't even want to start looking. But since starting his journey, he had found enough cheese in the corridors to keep him going. Now he looked forward to find more. Just looking ahead was becoming exciting. His old thinking had been clouded by his worries and fears. He used to think about not having enough cheese or not having it last as long as he wanted. He used to think more about what could go wrong than what could go right. But had but that had changed in the days since he had left Cheese Station C. He used to believe that cheese should never be moved and that change wasn't right. Now he realized it was natural for change to continually occur, whether you expect it or not. Change could surprise you only if you didn't expect. Change could surprise you only if you didn't expect it and weren't looking for it. When he realized he had changed his beliefs, he paused to write on the wall. It's safer to search in the maze than remain in a cheeseless situation. How hadn't found any cheese yet. But as he ran, How hadn't found any cheese yet. But as he ran through the maze, he thought about what he had already learned. How now realized that his new beliefs were encouraging new behaviors. He was behaving differently than when he kept returning to the same cheeseless situation. He was behaving differently than when he kept returning to the same cheeseless station. He knew that when you change what you believe, you change what you do. You can believe that a change will harm you and resist it. Or you can believe that finding new cheese will help you and embrace the change. It all depends on what you choose to believe, he wrote on the wall. Old beliefs do not lead you to new cheese. When you see that you can find and enjoy new cheese, you change course. How knew he would be in better shape now if he had dealt with the change much sooner and left Cheese Station C earlier. He would feel stronger in body. How knew he would be in better shape now if he had dealt with the change much sooner and left Cheese Station C earlier. He would feel stronger in body and spirit, and he could have coped better with the challenge of finding new cheese. In fact, The probably, in fact, he probably would have found it by now if he had expected change, rather than wasting time denying that the change had already taken place. He used his imagination again and saw himself finding and savoring that. He used his imagination again and saw himself finding and savoring new cheese. He decided to proceed into the more unknown part of the maze and found little bits of cheese here and there. Howe began to regain his strength and confidence as he thought back on where he had come from. Howe was glad he had written on the wall in many places. He trusted that it would serve as a marked trail for him to follow through the maze if he ever chose to leave Cheese Station C. Howe just hoped he was heading in the right direction. He thought about the possibility that him would read the handwriting on the wall and find his way. He wrote on the wall what he had been thinking about for some time. Noticing small changes earlier helps you adapt to the bigger changes that are to come. By now, Howe had let go of the past and was adapting to the present. He continued on through the maze with greater strength and speed, and before long it happened forever. His journey, or at least this part of his journey, ended quickly and happily. Howe proceeded along a corridor that was new to him, rounded a corner, and found new cheese at Cheese Station Inn. When he went inside, he was startled. When he went inside, he was startled by what he was. When he was no. When he went inside, he was startled by what he saw. Piled high everywhere was the greatest supply of cheese he had ever seen. He didn't recognize all that he saw, as some kinds of cheese were new to him. Then he wondered for a moment whether it was real or just his imagination, until he saw his old friend Sniff and Scurry. Sniff welcomed Howe with a nod of his head, and Scurry waved his paw. Their fat little bellies showed that they had been here for some time. Howe quickly said his hellos and soon took bits of every one of his Howe quickly said his hellos and soon took bits of every one of his favorite cheeses. He pulled off no, he pulled off his shoes, tied the laces together, and hung them around his neck, in case he needed them again. Sniff and Scurry laughed. They nodded their heads in admiration. Then Howe jumped into the new cheese. When he had eaten his fill, he left a piece of fresh cheese and made a toast. Hooray for change! Hooray for change! As How enjoyed the new cheese, he reflected on what he had learned. He realized that when he had been afraid of change, he realized that when he had been afraid to change, he had been holding on to the illusion. He realized that when he had been afraid to change, he had been holding on to the illusion of old cheese that was no longer there. So, what was it that made him change? What? So, so what was it? What was it? So, what was it that made him change? Was it the fear of starving to death? Howe smiled as though it certainly had. Then he laughed and realized that he had started to change as soon as he had learned to laugh at himself and at what he had been doing wrong. He realized the fastest way to change is to laugh at your own folly. Then you can let go and quickly move on. He knew he had learned something useful about moving on from his mice friends Sniff and Scurry. They kept life simple. They didn't overanalyze or overcomplicate things. When the situation changed and the cheese had been moved, they changed and moved with the cheese. He would remember that Howe had also used his wonderful brain to do what little people do better than mice. He envisioned he envisioned himself in realistic detail, finding something better, much better. He reflected on the mistakes he had made in the past and used them to plan for his future. He knew that you could learn to deal with change. You could be more aware of the need to keep things simple, be flexible, and move quickly. You did not need to overcomplicate. You did not need to overcomplicate matters or confuse. You did not need to overcomplicate matters or confuse yourself with fearful beliefs. You could notice when the little changes began so that you would be better prepared for the big change that might be coming. He knew he needed to adapt faster, for if you do not adapt in time, you might as well not adapt at all. He had to admit that the biggest inhibitor to change lies within yourself and that nothing gets better until you change. Perhaps most importantly, he realized that there is always new cheese out there, whether you recognize it at the time or not, and that you are rewarded with it when you go past your fear and enjoy the adventure. He knew some fear should be respected as it can keep you out of real danger. But he realized most of his fears were irrational and had kept him from changing when he needed to. He didn't like He didn't like it at the time, but he knew that the change had turned out to be a blessing in disguise, as it led him to find better cheese. He had even found a better part of himself. He, as Howe recalled what he had learned, he thought about his friend's hymn. He wondered if him had read any of the saying Howe had written on the wall at Cheese Station C and throughout the maze. Had him ever decided to let go and move on? Had he ever entered the maze and discovered what could make him no. Had he ever entered the maze and discovered what could make his life better? Or was he still hemmed in because he would not change? Howe thought about going back again to Cheese Station C to see if he could find him, assuming that Howe could find his way back there. If he found him, he thought he might be able to show him how to get out of his predicament. But Howe realized that he had already tried to get his friends to change. Him had to find his own way beyond his comforts and past his fears. No one else could do it. No one. Him had to find his own way beyond his comforts and past his fears. No one else could do it for him. No one else could do it for him or talk him into it. He somehow had to see the advantage of changing himself. Howe knew he had left a trail for him and that he could find his way if he could just read the handwriting on the wall. He went over and wrote down a summary of what he had learned on the largest wall of the Cheese Station Inn. He drew a large piece of cheese around all the insights he had become aware of, and smiled as he looked at what he had learned. Change happens, they keep moving the cheese. Anticipated cheese. No, مش هي دي. Change happens, they keep moving the cheese. Anticipate change, get ready for the cheese to move. Monitor change, smell the cheese often so you know when it is getting old. Adapt to change quickly. The quicker you let go of all cheese, adapt to change quickly. The quicker you let go of all cheese, the sooner you can enjoy new cheese. Change, move with the cheese. Enjoy change. Be ready to change quickly and enjoy it again and again. They keep moving the cheese. Howe realized how far he had come since he had been with him in Cheese Station C, but knew it would be easy for him to slip back if he could too comfortable. So each day he inspected Cheese Station N to see what he conditioned. So each day he inspected Cheese Station N to see what the condition of his cheese was. He was going to do whatever he could to avoid being surprised by unexpected change. While House still had a great supply of cheese, he often went out into the maze and explored new areas to stay in touch with what was happening around him. He knew it was safer to be aware of his real choices than to isolate himself in his comfort zone. Then Howe heard what he thought was the sound of movement out in the maze. Then Howe heard what he thought was the sound of movement out in the maze. As the noise grew louder, he realized that someone was coming. Could it be that him was arriving? Was he about to turn the corner? House said a little prayer and hoped, as he had many times before, that maybe at last his friend was finally able to move with the cheese and enjoy it. Move with the cheese and enjoy it. Me, how is a good character that represents so many? How is one of the characters that represents the majority of us. So, thank you.